All right,
Good luck
so
with
before we start, how would you rather I rank the range specs? Do you think I should rank them just within range specs only, or should I rank them
Yeah,
on a tier list
probably.
like
Yeah,
compared
I
to
think it
other
should
stuff?
be. Don't like put like one spec in A and then everything be in lower because it doesn't compare to melee or whatever. Just like rank them
Right,
against each other.
just
Be
against each
generous,
other.
probably.
Okay.
Today we're going to be doing the official day 1 of Dragonflight season 1 range tier list. I've been asked over and over again, what are the best DPS specs? What are the best melee specs? And I'm just a cat with a waffle on his head. I play only healers, but today joining me is my range DPS expert friend, MDI caster, world first raider, coffee, espresso aficionado. It's Xyronic. How's it going, buddy? Heck yeah. He's not muted. He's not muted. Oh no! Wait! Wait! No! I did. He is muted. Oh god.
Oh
no!
my
I
God.
Oh my
no.
god.
No,
Literally
hold on, hold
dono
on.
walled him so hard.
Hold on,
Holy
hold
shit.
on.
Take
Jesus
two,
Christ.
run it back.
Take
Got to
two,
do the
take
whole
two.
intro all over again.
Take 2. All right, Dorky, you have to kick us off again.
Are you ready? 3,
Yep.
2, 1. Hello friends, this is Growl.
And today I'm going to be bringing you the day 1 of Dragonflight season 1 Mythic Plus tier list for range DPS. I've been asked over and over every time I stream, what is the best DPS? How do I get invited to keys? And you know what? I'm just not an expert. I've been scared. I don't know what to say, but joining me today is my range DPS expert, world first raider, MDI caster, coffee espresso aficionado, Xyronic. How are you doing today, bud?
I'm doing good, man. And unlike you, while I am unsure of where things are going to stand, I am not afraid to make things up and put it on the internet. I'll be confidently incorrect if I have to be.
Love to see it. All right, so we're going to break down all the range DPS as we've been seeing them in the beta. You've been playing a decent amount of range DPS in the beta now, have you? Do you know how I know I have at least 300 or 400 hours logged in.
I probably have a little bit less than that, but I've played most of the specs. There's only a couple that I haven't seen a whole lot of, but I think I've got a good enough idea from, playing over the several weekends of Mythic Plus we've gotten to put them in a rough idea of a tier list.
Yeah, right on. All right, so without further ado, I guess I'll briefly go over what I think of the tiers, then maybe you can adjust accordingly. S tier, I feel like, is going to be stuff that we'd expect to pop up in the meta. If you're going to bring a range DPS in your group, that's going to be it. Probably brings a lot, doing a lot of damage. Then looking at A tier, probably looking at classes that are decent. You could bring them to high keys if they're played well, and if you may not see them in all the world first keys. Probably pretty viable, pretty strong classes. Then we get down to the B tier. We're starting to see classes that are less good, maybe either less damage or just not performing as well. And then into the C and D tier, hopefully we don't see too many classes down there. Does that sound about accurate?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Just kind of general, lacking of certain things in the A and B tier that just doesn't quite make them S tier. I agree with that.
Right on. So we see that you're leveling mage first, which means that you are a mage expert and you're going to main mage for the entire Dragonflight. So let's start with everyone's favorite mage spec, Arcane. We're starting it off strong. Where would you place Arcane Mage?
Arcane Mage. So Arcane received, all the mage specs actually received very little changes to how they actually play going into the expansion. I think Arcane is actually kind of a sleeper good spec right now. Its single target damage for rank specs is one of the best in the game, and they actually do pretty good burst. The biggest problem with Arcane Mage right now, though, is that they're insanely cooldown reliant. If they don't have surge and touch up, their damage is pretty bad. That being said, if you go into a big AoE pack, they're going to burst on it, do a ton of damage. And of course, they bring the typical mage utility. Mage utility across the board for all 3 specs right now is insanely good going into this expansion. Every single mage spec has Blast Wave. Every single mage spec has Dragon's Breath. They all bring Lust. There's just a lot of really good utility options that you have as mage. And of course, they all have Greater Invis now too, which is just a really nice extra big damage reduction in general. And of course, they always have Ice Block. So just in general, I think mage is a pretty solid spec. I don't think it's something that you're going to see in the most amount of keys run, because there's a lot of other good lust options in groups right now. But if I had to put it in a particular tier right now, I'd probably say it's borderline A and B tier for Mythic Plus. I would probably want to put it in low A tier. It's generally going to be actually pretty good, but I don't think it's going to be the number 1 range spec you'll see in high-end keys.
Yeah, right on. I feel like tankiness is pretty important too. Like having that greater invis, having ice block, all that sorts of things, because there's actually so much damage in some of these keys in Dragonflight, as we'll start to see some of the other specs that are less durable. I think that actually is sort of a point against them.
Yeah, there are definitely some specs that suffer due to not having enough like utility buttons, but we'll get to those later on. Mage definitely does have enough buttons to deal with a lot of the stuff that you see in Mythic Plus right now.
All right, so while we're talking about mages, now Fire Mage. Where are we putting Fire Mage?
Oh man. All right. Well, Fire Mage is definitely a spec that is very much fallen from grace compared to where it was at the end of last expansion and even in pre-patch. It's been nerfed several times throughout the course of the beta, not only directly from literal nerfs saying, hey, fire is now 10% worse or something like that, but also due to just passive nerfs. Like, for instance, the nerf to secondary stats that we saw on gems and profession stuff a couple weekends ago. That was also indirectly a big nerf to fire because fire is so haste dependent. Having that extra like 5 or 6% haste would have been really important, and it might have made Fire Mage a little bit better than it currently is. But the problem with Fire Mage right now is it just doesn't do enough damage. Fire Mage, compared to the other two specs, you have a class that does prio damage, then it spreads its ignite to other targets, which is good if it does really good damage. We've seen how ridiculous that can be if you go back to the end of BFA, right? But the problem is it literally just doesn't do enough damage right now. It has all the same utility as Arcane and Frost, but it doesn't bring a slow that Frost has, and it doesn't bring the insane damage that Arcane does. So I don't think you'd ever play this spec over the other two. So I think it would go, honestly, into the D tier for Mythic Plus.
Our first D tier. I'm going to inject some copium into the Fire Mages. At the beginning of Shadowlands, Fire Mage, it was in the exact same spot. Its damage wasn't great. They changed the way Ignite spreading works, and everyone was sleeping on it. Everyone was saying Frost Mage S tier. And then I don't know if it got some buffs or what happened, but it ended up that people were actually playing Fire Mage at the end of Season 1 of Dragonflight, even though everyone rated it really low. Is there some copium for Fire Mages that maybe they underperform in raid and get buffed and it starts to carry over in M+?
There's always a possibility, right? Like, remember, this is a day one tier list, right? So there's definitely some tuning passes that are going to be done in the early days of Dragonflight. I would not be at all surprised to see buffs to fire because it's like incredibly low damage wise. Like, for instance, like, I'm not kidding when I say that its damage is one of the lowest in the game right now. If you go look at Simcraft right now, Arcane Mage with no tier bonuses sims for like 10k more DPS than fire does with tier bonus. So it's like 65k versus 55k. It's really bad. Obviously, I think fire is going to be a spec that scales extremely well into later tiers of the expansion, but for Season 1 of Dragonflight, unless it gets some pretty big buffs at the start of the tier here, I don't think it's going to be very good.
All right, fair enough. And now we have the last mage spec, Frost Mage. Where would you be putting Frost Mage in the beta so far?
So Frost Mage is like in a very similar spot to where it was at the start of Shadowlands beta, right? It's a spec that has really consistent damage almost all the time. It doesn't really get screwed by its cooldowns anymore. So Icy Propulsion is back. It's the thing that reduces the cooldown of Icy Veins. But the thing is, it works when you're not in Icy Veins now. So if you drop your Icy Veins, you still have Icy Propulsion active, which means you lower the cooldown of your Icy Veins, you get back into your cooldown faster. And that was one of the big quality of life things that I think everyone had to deal with back in Season 1 of Shadowlands. If you remember that, your mage was like, Icy Veins is up. I need you to pull right now. And tanks hated Frost Mages because of it. That's not a problem anymore. But again, it's a mage spec, right? It has Lust, it has all those utility things, it brings Arcane Intellect, it still has Greater Invis. Now Frost also has Dragon's Breath. It also has Blast Wave. It has a lot of good utility buttons. And also, it's the only spec in the game that will constantly slow every single mob that you hit by 60%, which is insane for tanks. I remember playing with Dorky on beta, and he's like, all right, I need you to play Frost again because there's some of these pulls that we just can't do without that slow. So for that reason, and the damage is good, it's focused DPS profile, which is always good for Mythic Plus. I think it's a pretty solid A tier spec. I think you could see people playing either Arcane or Frost, depending on the dungeon.
Yeah, that slow is really, really big. Especially while tanks are strongish right now. Early on, before tanks get their gear, before they get their 4-piece, in some of those really tough fortified pulls, you definitely notice when you have a team that doesn't have any slows, and as a tank, you just cannot get away. So yeah, I definitely agree that Frost Mage is going to be pretty valuable early on. All right, so let's spice things up. Let's switch it up. This is a class that one of the last classes I saw you playing quite a bit on the beta is Elemental Shaman. I feel like there's always this group of people who are like diehard Ele Shamans, and Ele Shaman hasn't really been popular since like early Shadowlands, but even then I don't know if I would consider it meta. Where do you think you would rank Ele Shaman?
All right, this is going to be controversial.
Uh-oh.
I'm putting it in high A tier.
Oh,
Ellie Shaman is a banger of a spec. Now, here's the thing, right? It does have some problems, and it has some pretty egregious problems, but if your group can play around it, they're going to be insanely good. They have a lot of really good utility. They have a great damage profile right now. Ancestral Guidance is one of the coolest like off-field DPS cooldowns in the game. It will literally top your group for the 10 seconds up, but there are some insanely egregious problems with it that your healer has to be very aware of. Ellie Shaman dies very easily. It has two major personals. It has Astral Shift, which is a 90-second wall, which is really good. And then you have Earth Elemental, which is a 5% DR and a 10% stamina buff. Outside of those two buttons, you have nothing else to deal with incoming damage. You can heal yourself, and that's it. And if you get targeted by two major damage events over the course of 90 seconds, you will actually just die unless your healer has some way to save you. So I think it's like insane for damage output, but it does have some pretty big drawbacks. But if your group can play around those drawbacks, I think Ellie's going to be one of the strongest DPS specs for this first tier of the expansion.
yeah. One thing I think a lot of people underrate when it comes to ranged is Ellie Shaman's kick is so good, right? And then on top of that, you can take Cap Totem and you can take either one of the talents that either reduce the cooldown or make it go off twice. I feel like there's a lot of mobs in this expansion that really need those kicks, really need the disruption. And having classes like Shadow Priest, for example, like really, really long cooldown kick. Shaman's having a 12-second kick, I actually think is pretty valuable compared to all the other range specs.
Yeah, and there's other sort of things that you can spec into as well for a little bit of extra like utility. You have Tremor Totem. You don't take it in the base spec, but you can take it in certain dungeons like Azure Vaults if you accidentally let some of the fears go off in there, right? You have your Cap Totem still, which can be a double stun if you take the right talent point for it. You still have Purge. You still have Cleanse Spirit. There's a lot of really nice utility totems that you can spec into to help your group out. And I think it's just overall going to be a generally very good spec for Mythic Plus.
All right, right on. All right, now we'll dive into another class that I think of when I think of you is the Warlock, and we will start with Affliction. I feel like I've never played Mythic Plus when Affliction is good ever in Mythic Plus. Will that change?
Well, no. Not really. Affliction Warlock is probably middle of the road when it comes to how good it is in Mythic Plus right now. It has the same problem that a lot of specs have with Mythic Plus right now, where in order to do good AoE damage, you have to very specifically spec into doing good AoE damage. But by speccing into good AoE damage, you spec out of your single target damage. So Affliction Lock is a spec similar to a couple other specs we'll cover in a little bit here, where it'll blast on AoE packs, but then you go on to a boss and it's doing tank damage. So that could be really good if the rest of the DPS in your group are doing good single target damage. But if you have three of those, low single target DPS classes in your group, you're going to be suffering on bosses, especially on something like a Tyrannical Week. So it can be played around, but I don't think it's one of the better specs right now. I'm kind of struggling on where I want to put this spec. I think it's either going to be low B tier or high C tier. I'm probably going to err on the side of low B tier because it still is a Warlock, right? It still has access to all the base utility. You still get Healthstones, you still get Gateways, you still get Curses, which are even stronger this expansion with the Amplify Curse setup, which you can do things like you can slow the cast of certain mobs by like 60%, which is hilariously good. And the actual overall damage profile in dungeons like Algathar Academy, you can be competitive with other high-end specs as Affliction. You're just, like I said, you're going to do a lot less damage on bosses, which is pretty bad for time.
Yeah, no one will notice though, right? You just pat on all the AoE flowers and your numbers look good even though you're doing tank damage on a boss.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, the next Warlock spec. This spec completely dominated the end of Shadowlands to the point where everyone in the comments always thinks that this class will be the best spec forever and will be completely OP. It is Destrolock. How are you feeling about Destrolock in Season 1 of Dragonflight?
So this is interesting. Destrolock actually has some of the same problems that Affliction has, where you can spec into more AoE damage or you can spec into more single target. But I feel like it actually does more damage right now than Affliction does, while still having all the same utility. But I wouldn't want to play it over the other specs that we've already put in the A tier. So this is a high B spec. You still have Amplify Curse, you still have Hellstones. It's still a good spec in general. Like, you're not upset if you see a Destrolock in your group. Actually, you might be upset because you'd probably want to see them playing the other Warlock spec that we haven't put on the tier list yet. But it's still like a pretty okay spec in general, right? It's okay damage. It'll either do really good single target or solid AoE. The biggest problem with Destro right now is the new talent system didn't really do it any favors. If you wanted to play a similar Destro build to like what we played at the end of Shadowlands when it was completely broken and destroying damage meters in Mythic Plus, you can't actually put together the same build. Like there's not enough talent points on your tree to get enough capstones to play the same build. So you feel like you're playing like a dumbed down version of the spec that doesn't have access to the same power that you had in Shadowlands, which kind of feels bad in general, right? It just doesn't do the things that it used to do. So it feels bad to play it. You know, it's in an okay spot, but it's definitely very behind Demonology, which is what we're about to talk about.
All right, spoilers. The last Warlock spec, Demonology. There can't be a Warlock spec that you can't have all the Warlock specs be your lower. Where are we putting Demolock?
Just jam it in the S tier, man. We both know it
all
goes
the way
there.
up there. Look at them.
Just jam it. Now, here's the thing. Demonology, honestly, like the damage that it can do in Mythic Plus, in addition to the tankiness that Warlock has just in general, and both Affliction and Destro have this general tankiness too. There's so many passive talent points in the tree that they just have 10% more HP and like 20% more damage reduction passive than every other spec in the game, which is not okay. But Demonology actually does both good single target and good AoE. And I think it's like almost the only spec out of any of the range specs in the game that can compete with melee specs right now. I want to point out, we talked about this before we started making this video. I was asking you, do you want me to rate the range specs like in their own tier list? Or do you want me to put them like on an overall tier list? If we were ranking this on an overall tier list, I would actually shift every other spec down a letter compared to melee, but Demo would still be an S tier. That's how good Demo is right now. It is just a very, very good spec across the board. And it actually got buffed in the most recent patch notes. They buffed the tier set for Demonology, and I'm not really sure why, but there you go. It's just going to be an overall insanely good spec, and I'd be very surprised if this isn't like the premier range spec you see for most key pushing.
Right on. Yeah, I think that tankiness does play a big factor. It's hard to say, and I know most ranged players don't care, but from a healer's perspective, it's always nice to have that Demolock who's just literally invulnerable, and you can just focus your healing on the other members of the party. It makes the AoE healing checks a lot more reasonable to get through.
Yeah.
So now for let's call it the support class. You know, maybe this class is making the life of your healer easier too. Everyone's favorite, the Moonkin. I haven't seen too many Moonkins. I saw Tettles actually practicing his Feral Druid, which was a little bit suspect. What do you think about Moonkin in this current meta right now, Xyro?
Okay, so let's start with a little disclaimer here. Never trust Moonkins. They are one of the most notorious class, and this is coming from a Mage Warlock player, by the way. They're one of the most notorious groups of a particular like class/spec player that will never properly tell you how good their spec is. If they're complaining, they're probably already good. They just want to be better. And if they're really good, they're probably sandbagging because they actually just don't want to get nerfed. Like this spec is actually in a perfectly okay spot right now. It's not OP. It's not bad. It's just a general middle of the pack spec right now. It does pretty solid overall damage. It can burst pretty good on AoE packs or on single target, right? But they have to commit their cooldown to that. I would probably rate them, I would say B tier above the two Warlock specs. They are a generally pretty good spec. You should be able to do 20s with them in the first week. They shouldn't really bring a group down too much. They have Nature's Vigil now, which is good group healing. They still have all the same utility that you're used to a Druid bringing to the group, right? They're not as bad as they think they are, right? They're not as bad as they say they are almost ever.
Yeah, I've had a little bit of experience playing with Moonkins, and I completely agree with you. I feel like if played correctly and you're really focused on damage and doing things well, it can be a decent class. It's tough to compare it to something like Frost Mage or Demolock, but it's definitely something that you're not going to feel terrible about taking into keys. But chances are, in its current state, probably won't see like place in World First keys.
Yeah, I agree. It'll be one of those specs that's up there. It won't be in like the world first ones unless like someone very particular in a high-end guild is playing it. But it's not going to be top of the line.
All right. Next, we have everybody in the chat's favorite, Shadow Priest. Where would you put Shadow Priest on this list?
Okay. As much as I'd like to sit here and make fun of Twix, Shadow Priest is actually in an okay spot. It's not a good spec, and I actually think that Shadow Priest is in a very, very similar position damage profile-wise to Affliction Warlock, but it doesn't have the same tankiness that Affliction Warlock has. I think one of the premier like talking points for bringing a Shadow Priest to a Mythic Plus group right now is they're extremely good at self-sustain. If you go like look at an AoE pack, they're doing something like 15k self-HPS, right? But they generally like are less tanky overall than the Affliction Warlock. Now, the one caveat is that they bring PI, which is very useful in certain situations and makes people like me really happy when I'm playing a Frost Mage or, you know, a Warlock myself. I don't think the PI is good enough to put it in a high tier, though. I think that I'm trying to figure out if I want to put it low B or high C. It's one of those two. It's definitely below the 2 Warlock specs, but I don't know. It's like right on the borderline right now. I think it's fair to put it in low B, below the 2 Warlock specs. It's like right there on the cusp, though. Okay, you know what? Actually, hold on.
Oh.
I want to put it in C tier. There's one big problem with Shadow Priest. Its kick is 45 seconds.
Yep,
that's a really bad.
That was what I was gonna say.
That was the thing that I remembered right now. It's bad. C tier is definitely where that goes.
Well, that's the problem too, right? Is you're talking about PI, but okay, you have a demo lock or something like a mage that you're PIing. So now you have a bad Shadow Priest kick and another non-melee kick. So in a world where you can play a class that really, really benefits from that haste, I don't know, maybe there's a world where you play Feral Druid or something, but I feel like if you could somehow get great use out of that PI, it would maybe go up a little bit, but it's just too hard in the current dungeon setup with how much stops and kicks required.
Well, that is true. And I think another thing that people are going to have to realize now is I think it's fine actually to have 1 or 2 bad range kicks because of most healers can spec into a kick now as well.
True.
But healers are going to have to get used to having that because unless you played a Resto Shaman,
then you got to rely on a healer.
Used to it. But yeah, nobody wants to rely on a healer for a kick. So, having a Shadow Priest 45-second kick in your group is definitely not something you want to rely on.
All right, next, this is the only ranged DPS spec that I've ever played a Mythic Plus dungeon on. It is the Devastation Evoker. This class is pretty interesting. I've heard lots of mixed opinions about it in terms of how fun it is to play, but how strong is it, would you say?
So I've only played with a couple of Devastation Evokers. I played with J-Funk for a little while, and I can see he's in chat right now, so hopefully he can just fact check everything that I'm saying. Devastation Evoker is a class that I don't think is really high on the utility side. You have a couple of knockbacks. You have a root. You have a CC amplifier, which is actually pretty cool. Like it's a button that you press, and then every CC that goes on them after you press it is like increased by a percentage. It brings bloodlust. It brings a buff that makes your movement speed cooldowns a little bit shorter. But I don't think the utility is really that high for it. I think the biggest thing utility-wise is probably like the AoE soothe or the any dispel that it has. Right, it can dispel any sort of debuff. But I think those are things that can be covered by other classes in your group, generally speaking. So I feel like Evoker is going to be a spec that kind of lives or dies by the damage that it can do. And from what I've seen, the AoE damage or just general overall damage in Mythic Plus, like really hasn't been that impressive for me. Like based off of pure damage alone, I would probably put this like in the mid B tier, probably above Destrolock, below Moonkin. Like it's just a relatively decent spec right now. It really, really, really needs big pulls in order to pull around its cooldowns for it to do good damage. And even then, I think it pales in comparison to the, the S and A tier specs on this list. I think it's a very solid option, and like you can definitely make it work. And it's a really good spec just in general if you need a bloodlust for your group, because it does bring that. But I don't think it's going to be one of those like premier key pushing specs that you'll see the best groups go for.
Yeah, right on. I also want to add too that, dude, this class is so easy. As a healer, this is the first class that I've played in a key where I could do more than tank damage. So honestly, being middle of the pack and being very easy, I think is not even that bad of a spot.
Yeah, honestly, it's in a fine spot, right? Like if you look at the specs that it's next to in terms of complexity to play, like the amount of buttons that Warlock and Boom can have versus Devastation Evoker is like hilarious. They might have double the number of buttons on their bars.
All right, so the last class, and as a bit of disclaimer, I think Xyro can agree that we just didn't really see as many hunters on the beta, especially marks, and so this is going to be a little bit up in the air. So, I mean, part of the reason that you don't see them is because they're probably not very good. But these are definitely going to be, I think, a little bit harder for us to rank, but I'm going to throw it in Xyro's court, and you can try and do your best. Let's start with Marks Hunter first. Any thoughts on Marks Hunter?
So everything that I've heard from the pros that are playing it, especially Azertharian, are saying that Marksman is literal dumpster tier right now. Like bottom of the bottom. It'll be below Fire Mage. The damage is just not there for Marks. They got a little bit of a aim shot buff about a week ago, and it still is not good. And this is a spec that, I mean, Marksman is just a pure damage spec, right? Like there's a little bit of utility with Hunter and keys, right? Like things like Binding Shot are generally pretty good, but outside of that, like Hunter tends to be one of the weakest specs just in the game in terms of surviving things. Also, Binding Shot got Giga Nerf coming into the expansion, so it's really not even that good anymore. It's pretty bad. So like, I don't know where Hunter would be brought into Mythic Plus unless it's doing like demo lock tier damage. It just is not good at all right now.
Yeah, I think it's hard in a lot of ways in that, like, you don't have that binding shot CC, having the range kick isn't great, it's kind of squishy to, like, AoE damage, so that's going to be tough compared to, like, mages, blocks. Alright, before we make everybody too sad, we'll now move on to the last spec, Beast Mastery Hunter. We've seen some BM Hunter. It was actually really, really overtuned, I felt, at the start of the beta, but then it kind of got tuned back to normalcy, and we saw less people play it. Where would you rank BM Hunter right now?
Yeah, so the only time we actually saw BM Hunter for the most part was when it was bugged and it was proccing Beast Cleave multiple times off of abilities that weren't even supposed to proc it in the first place. And it was doing more damage than everything in the game. Once those bugs were fixed, it was brought back down to earth like crazy. It went way, way down below a lot of other specs. I think the best place to put this right now is probably below Shadow in the C tier right now. I mean, BM, again, Hunter is a class that lives and dies by its damage output and keys, especially with Binding Shot being nerfed. If its damage isn't good, then there's really no reason to bring it to the keys. I mean, part of the other things that we were talking about, I didn't even cover Turtle, right? Like, Turtle is one of the fakest immunities in the game. You have to pre-use it on everything. It's not like Cloak of Shadows. It's not like Ice Block. You have to deflect the ability with Turtle. It can be used to clear certain things in Mythic Plus, so it does definitely have some utility. But I feel like these two specs, BM and Marksman, need some insane buffs for them to see like good placement in high tier keys. And I think it's important to point out, just because these specs are listed in like the C and D tier doesn't mean that you can't play them at all. I think you'll be able to do 20s on them still week 1 if you're playing with a dedicated group. It'll just be significantly harder to do so.
Yeah, and I think the tier, having him separated like this, it's hard because on one hand, you want to kind of be the copium guy and put everything close together to say that it's all viable, but I do think it helps when you did a pretty even distribution across all the tiers. People can get a genuine idea of like what ranks above what, and it's more fine-tuned, whereas when you throw everything in A tier and B tier, it's like kind of hard to judge. So nice, I'm glad, sometimes, you got to say it, you got to rip the band-aid off, call some of the classes bad, but keep in mind, again, this is just day 1 of Dragonflight. We're an hour before the servers come up, so hopefully some of these classes can see some buffs or get improved. That wraps up the range tier list. Thanks a lot, Xyro. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to add to all of our ranged friends out there?
No.
All right,
I was doing a dorky thing.
All right, well, that wraps up the video. Thanks everyone for watching. I really appreciate you guys. Good luck in your ranged DPS adventures, and happy keying, friends.
I actually did.
Shaman is copium.
I did.
All right, Dorky,
say,
get in here, Dorky. Rip them apart.
It's copium, man. This shit is copium.
Listen,
Ellie's that high, but Shadow Priest isn't. They're like equally as bad.
No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not.
They're pretty close.
No. Ellie is so much better. I'm telling you, I was doing things wrong, but
you were sandbagging really
when
hard.
when I was not dying, when I had healers that would like external me and shit. I would have Okay, Ellie needs it.
Oh
Ellie needs it, man. You have to babysit an Ellie Shaman. You have to.
All right, then you might as well have something else in your group.
What? Okay,